Welcome to the first video on how to create a tip calculator inside an HTML file using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The tip calculator will look something like this when we're finished, and the purpose of it is that the user puts in how much their bill was and then chooses a service type, and that determines the tip percentage. And then the browser is going to run JavaScript to calculate the tip amount when they hit the calculate button. And after that, below it, it'll return a tip value based off of the inputs from the user. So what this is going to do is allow us to create a form and then pull information from that form and calculate some values off of it using JavaScript. So this is going to use all three coding types of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Some things we need to know and understand are how to create HTML forms, which allow users to input values via text boxes, multiple choices, drop-down boxes, buttons, all those kinds of things. We also need to understand what an HTML ID is. We've worked with classes before where you're calling upon a class to stylize it inside the CSS using the class attribute in HTML and the period before the selector in CSS to call upon it. But IDs are a little bit different, and they allow you to identify a specific area or input and name it, and then allow things to call upon it. And then we're also going to need to understand what the JavaScript getElementById function is. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to pull and return values and information from the HTML file and utilize them inside the JavaScript. So HTML forms are usually inside of a form tag, and they allow you to collect information from the users. You do forms all the time, anytime you're creating an account, anytime you're purchasing something online, anytime you are really doing a lot of the things that you're doing online, you're using a form. So when they ask you for your first name, last name, email address, those are all forms. And it can contain elements inside of it, and they're all called inputs usually, where the user is inputting something for you to use. So the input element can look in various ways because it has an attribute called type. And so you can do like a type of a text, which would be a single text field. You could do a type of a radio, which would be like a multiple choice option. You could do a submit button, a drop-down menu, a checkbox. There's lots of different types, but essentially when you want the user to be able to input something to you or give something to you, you use an input and then you specify a type for it. So we're going to go into CodePen and create a little form together because before we can begin calculating anything, we got to create a form to create stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and go into CodePen, and I'm going to create a new pen up at the top here called Tip Calculator. And we're going to start just by giving it a title. So I'm going to do an H1 tag. And inside my H1, I'm going to call this Tip Calculator. And so far, as you've been learning, you've kind of been using JavaScript in the console down here to create stuff and just see the output. But at this point, we're going to actually make the output and the functions be available for the user and make it look nice. So I know JavaScript kind of starts out kind of, bland and boring because it's only printing and console logging things. But you can make it have interactivity with the HTML and CSS and make it look nice for the user. So I can take my H1 and just like we have before in our CSS, I can call upon it, give it like a font family of Arial and a color of purple, just to make it look a little bit different. And then I'm going to go ahead and create that form. So I'm going to open up my form and then I'm going to close my form. Inside my form, you can have other types of tags besides inputs, and you can specify information. So for instance, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ask for an input of bill amount where they can type in what their bill amount was. So I'm going to go ahead and do an input. And an input is a standalone tag. It doesn't require a closing tag because it's just a box. And the computer knows where it should start and stop because it's an input value. So it puts that in, and you can see our box has appeared down here. And I'm going to give it a type of text to make sure that my computer knows and my browser knows that it's a text box. If I change this to radio, for instance, you should see that it'll turn into a little button right here. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to text, which is the default option. And that's where I want them to type their bill amount. Now, if you've ever been to a website that is poorly planned, you know that sometimes when you don't provide information, people don't know what to do. So we want to make sure that our forms are usable by everybody and understood by everyone. So before my input, I'm going to add a paragraph. And in my paragraph, I'm going to ask, how much was your bill? And when you do that, you can then have that input right there appear. Inside the form after that, I want to ask the user how their service was. And I want to do this where they pick a percentage essentially, and that I can grab that percentage and bring it in. So usually when you're tipping, you do like 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%, all those kinds of things. So I'm going to do a drop down menu this time. And so we're going to do an input. And actually, instead of it being an input this time, because it's a selection option, we aren't going to use input because the user isn't actually typing anything and they're not clicking on a button or a checkbox. They're actually choosing from a drop-down menu. So when you want to do a drop-down menu, instead of using something like, a type radio button where it would give an option like this, we are going to use a select. And when we use select, because there's multiple options in a drop-down menu usually, you have to open and you have to close it because we're going to choose different options in there. And you can see they're sitting on the same line. So I'm going to go ahead and put in here, when I do this, the first option that's available. And so to specify an option, it's kind of like a list. You specify the beginning of the list, the ending of the list, and then the options within that list. So I'm going to put option here. And then I'm going to close the option to specify when the option is available. And I'm going to do choose an option. So it says when the user comes here to choose an option. And you can see they're sitting next to each other. And to kind of break that up, I can do a couple different things. I can add a break tag, and that'll push it to the next line just like it would text. Or I can put some instructions, which I think is important for you to have instructions for your user. So I'm going to do, how was your service, in a paragraph. And that'll do automatic breaks for me. So that way I don't have to specify when the line break occurs, because a paragraph always has a break before and after. So then I'm going to add some more options. So my second option is going to be the highest value. And that's going to be 30% where we had outstanding service. And at that point, I'm just going to take this, and you can see here if you drop down, they're popping up as you put them in. I'm going to create some more options and copy and paste those. And I'm going to put a 20%, 15%, 10%, and do one more for 5%. And change these to like good for 20%, it was okay for 15%, bad for 10%, and terrible for 5%. So at this point, you should be able to input a bill amount, choose a service amount, and then what we want to do is have a button here that allows the user to calculate. So that actually comes after the form. And so we're going to go ahead and specify a button here. And a button requires an opening and closing tag because you want to specify inside of the button tag what the button says on it, like submit or you're done or whatever. And in this case, we want it to say calculate. And so you can see the second you type a word in between the two button tags, that the word calculate appears right here. And I'm going to go ahead and right after this form put a break tag to just kind of create some space between my option and my calculate. So at this point we have a form. It needs a lot more work to it to make it so that we can use it, but it's a form nonetheless. And I think what's important to note right now is that because your button sits outside of your form, they don't talk to each other, which means that when I hit calculate, it doesn't know what to calculate. And so we want to make sure that they talk to each other and that the button is aware of what type of button it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify a type for this button of button. And we are going to go ahead and make it named to the form. So what that means is our form needs a name. So up here in the opening form tag, we need to specify a name for our form. And we're going to do that by specifying an ID. An ID allows you to specify a unique identifier or a name for something, and we're going to be doing this a lot and talking about this a little bit more, but it gives it a name, and you can only have an ID once. It's unique on this HTML document. So I'm going to name this tip calculator, and by naming it tip calculator, I can then go down to my button and I can have my button talk to my tip calculator form by grabbing the form called tip calculator. So now they're connected and working together. So we've created a form and we've got a bunch of options in here. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and start calling upon those things using JavaScript. So make sure you save your pen for us to be able to do that.